Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to read chapter 12 in The Darkest Minds by Alexandra Bracken. And if you haven't yet listened to the prologue up to now, and this is your first time tuning in, I highly recommend that you go to the playlist that I made, and I labeled it The Darkest Mind, so that way you can actually listen to the beginning up until now. And if you aren't subscribed already, I would really appreciate it if you subscribe and hit that like button. But no more wasting time. Let's get into it, shall we? The Darkest Minds by Alexandra Bracken. Chapter 12. The hot water was enough to make me forget. I was standing in an old motel shower, washing my hair with shampoo that reeked of fake lavender. In the entire compact bathroom, there were only 6 things: the sink, the toilet, the towel, the shower, its curtain, and me. I was the last one in. By the time I finally walked through the motel room door, Zoo had already been in and out, and Chubbs had just barricaded himself in the bathroom, where he spent the next hour scrubbing himself and all of his clothing until they stank of stale soap. It seemed pointless to me to try to do laundry in the sink with hand soap, but there was no bathtub or laundry detergent for him to use. The rest of us just sat back and tuned out his impassioned speech on the importance of good hygiene. "You're next," Liam said, turning to me. "Just make sure you wipe down everything when you're done." I caught the towel he threw to me. "What about you?" "I'll take one in the morning." With the bathroom door shut and locked behind me, I dropped my backpack on the toilet seat cover and went to work. Sorting through its contents, I pulled out the clothes they had given me and dumped them on the floor. Something silky and red spilled out on top of the pile, causing me to jump back in alarm. It took several moments of suspicious inspection to figure out what it was. The bright red dress from the trailer's closet. Zoo, I thought, passing a tired hand over my face. She must have grabbed it when I wasn't looking. I poked at it with a toe, nose wrinkling at its faint scent of stale cigarette smoke. It looked like it was going to be a size too big for me. Not to mention the somewhat icky feeling that came with knowing where it had been. But clearly she wanted me to have it, and wearing it, loath as I was to admit it, was smarter than running around in my camp uniform. I could do this for Zoo. If it made her happy, it'd be worth the discomfort. There was no shampoo, but the Children's League had thought to give me deodorant, a bright green toothbrush, a pack of tissues, some tampons, and hand sanitizer, all travel-sized and zipped up tight in a plastic bag. Under that was a small hairbrush and water bottle, and there, at the very bottom of the bag, was another panic button. It must have been there the entire time. And I just hadn't realized it. I'd thrown the first one Kate had given me away, leaving it behind in the mud and brush. The thought of this one had been in my bag the entire time, made my skin crawl. Why hadn't I thoroughly searched the bag before now? I picked it up between two fingers and dropped it into the sink, like it had been a piece of hot coal. My hand was on the faucet, ready to drown the stupid thing in the water and fry it for good. But something stopped me. I'm not sure how long I stared at it. I'm not sure how long I stared down at it before I picked it up again and held it toward the light, trying to see if I could peer inside the black outer shell. I looked for a red blinking light that would tell me if it was recording. I held it up to my ear, listening for any kind of whirring or beeping that would tell me if it was activated, if it was on, or if it really was a tracker. Wouldn't they have caught up to us by now? Was it so bad to keep it? Just in case? Just in case something happened again, and I couldn't help the others. Wouldn't being with the League be better than being thrown back into Thurman? Being killed? Wasn't anything better than that? While I put the panic button back in the pocket of the backpack, it wasn't for me. If Kate had seen me, she would have smiled, and the thought only made me angry all over again. I couldn't even believe in my own ability to protect these kids. Stepping under the shower's perfect warm spray was already surreal enough without having to hear the click, 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 beep of Thurman's automatic timer. To keep my wash time under 3 minutes. It was a good thing too, since the dirt seemed to come off in slow layers. A good 15 minutes of scrubbing, and it felt like I had turned every inch of my skin inside out. I even tried using the bubblegum pink razor that had been included in the hotel's small pack of soap and shampoo, opening up old and new scabs on my shins and knees. 16 years old, I thought, and this is the time I've been able to shave my legs. It was stupid, so stupid. I didn't know what I was doing, and I didn't care. I was old enough. No one was going to stop me. My mom always came back to me in flashes. Sometimes I'd hear her voice, just a word or two. Other times I'd have a memory of it. I'd have a memory so real, it was like reliving the moment altogether. And now, as I kept at it, all I could think of was that conversation we'd had about this very thing, and her smile as she repeated over and over again, maybe when you're 13. Eventually, I washed the razor off and threw it in the direction of my bag. I didn't think anyone else would want to use it now. With my blood running down my legs, I turned my attention to the nest on my head. My hair was still too tangled for me to run my hands through it. I had to work through it knot by knot, using more of the shampoo than I had ever meant to. And by the time I finished, I was crying. I'm 16. I don't know what brought it out. One minute, I was fine, and the next, it felt like my chest had collapsed in on itself. I tried to take in a deep breath, but the air was too hot. My hands found the wall's white tile first, a second before the rest of my body collapsed against it. I sat down on the rough, fake stone floor of the shower and pressed my hands to my chest, grateful for the noise of the running water and overhead vent, which hid the noise of me breaking into pieces. I didn't want them to hear me like this, especially not Zoo. It was stupid, so stupid. I was 16, so what? So what I hadn't seen my parents in 6 years? So what I might never see them again? It's not like they remembered me anyways. I should have been happy that it was over, that I was out of that place, but inside or out, I was alone, and I was beginning to wonder if I always had been, if I always would be. The water pressure wavered, its temperature spiking as someone in the next room over flushed the toilet. It didn't matter. I could barely feel it blasting against my back. My fingers went to my bleeding knees and pressed down, but I couldn't feel that either. Kate had told me that I needed to divide my life into 3 acts and close the first 2 behind me. But how did someone do that? How were you just supposed to forget? There was a knock on the door, faint, almost tentative at first, but more insistent when I didn't answer right away.
Ruby?
I heard Liam's voice call.
You okay?
I took a deep breath and reached back, hand feeling through the air for the faucet. The water overhead faded to a mere drizzle, and then a drip, and then nothing at all.
Can you, open the door just for a sec?
He sounded nervous, enough to make me nervous. For one terrifying split second, I thought something had happened. I reached for the towel and wrapped it around myself. My fingers flicked the lock over and were turning the doorknob before my brain caught up. A blast of icy air was the first thing to hit me. Liam's wide eyes were the second. The pair of big white socks in his hand, the third. He glanced around the bathroom, over my shoulder, his mouth pressed in a grim line. The motel room was darker than it had been when I first walked in. We must have been well into night now, so I couldn't be sure. Not in any real way, but I thought I caught a hint of color flooding the tips of his ears. "Is everything all right?" I whispered. He stared at me, letting the warm fog from the bathroom wash over him. "Liam?" The socks were thrust in my direction. I looked down at them and then up at him, hoping I didn't look as flabbergasted as I felt.
Just wanted to, give you these,
he said, giving them a little shake. He thrusted them again in my direction.
You know, for you.
Don't you need them?
I have a couple extra pairs. And you have none, right?
He looked like he was in some kind of pain now.
Seriously, please, just take them. Chubb says your extremities, or whatever, are the first things to get cold. So you need them, and... Oh my god! Green! I heard Chubb say from somewhere in the room. Just take the damn socks and put the kid out of his misery.
Liam didn't wait for me to hold out my hand. He reached past me and deposited them on the counter right next to the sink. Thanks, I said.
Great. I mean, no problem.
Liam turned to walk away, only to turn back again, as if thinking of something else.
Okay, great, cool. Well, so you... Use your words, Lee, Chubbs called. Some of us are trying to get some sleep. Oh, right, sleep.
Liam made a vague motion toward the room's bed.
You and Zoo are going to share. I hope you don't mind.
Of course not, I said.
Okay, great.
He put an abnormally bright smile on his face. I wondered what he was waiting for me to do or say. If this was one of those moments that being trapped in a cabin with dozens of girls for 6 years had failed to prepare me for. It was like we were speaking in two different languages. Yeah, great, I repeated, more confused now than ever. That seemed to do the trick, though. Liam turned and walked away without another word. I picked up my new socks from the counter, examining them. Just before I shut the door, I heard Chubb's voice, tinged with his usual, "Told you so." "Hope you're pleased with yourself," he was saying. "You should have just left her alone. She was fine." But I hadn't been, and somehow Liam had known. It took me several long moments to realize it was Zoo's dream. She and I were on the room's queen-size bed, huddled together for warmth. The boys were on the floor with the blankets, using extra towels stolen from the cleaning cart as pillows. The collective brain trust of Chubbs and Liam's hadn't been able to figure out how to turn down the air conditioning unit, which insisted on spitting out its frosty breath every time the room so much as dared to spike to 60 degrees. I had been hovering around the sweet, milky edges of sleep for hours when I felt the itch at my back, at the back of my mind. There was a part of me that had been expecting it, even though my body had settled onto the bed like a slab of concrete. My brain was still buzzing around in circles, processing what had happened with the PSFs, wondering if I could do what I had done to the man again, when Zoo's bare feet brushed against mine, and that was all it took. I was pulled into her dream head first. I was Zoo, and Zoo was in a small bed, staring up at the underbelly of a brown mattress. Darkness blurred around us until finally some recognizable shapes emerged. Stacks of bunk beds, a chalkboard, bright blue cabinets that stretched from floor to ceiling, large windows boarded up with plywood, and strange square discolorations on the wall.
where posters must have once hung. I couldn't tear away. That was the dangerous thing about dreams, how quickly you became tangled in it all. People naturally let their guard down when they slept, so much so that sometimes, if the dream was frightening enough, I didn't even need a touch to be drawn into it. I couldn't smell the smoke, but I saw it right away, gliding beneath the old classroom's door, like spilled milk racing across the ground. A moment later, I jolted up, rolling until I was off the bed completely. I watched in slow, dawning horror as a dozen girls jumped down from their bunks and gathered in a buzzing huddle at the corner of the room. One girl, who must have been a good head taller and 4 years older than the others, tried to get them to crouch in a line beneath the windows with no success. Her arms were waving through the air, the long sleeves of her simple mustard yellow uniform blurring. And then the alarms went off, and the doors at the far end of the room swung open. The sound the bell made was nearly as excruciating as the white noise. Its pitch stretched and distorted by the dream. I was jostled forward as the other girls made a break for the door. It didn't seem to matter to them that the smoke was suffocating or that it didn't have a visible source. In the place of neat, orderly lines was mass chaos. Kids with green, navy, and yellow uniforms spilled out into the white tiled hallway. The emergency lights were on, fire alarms flashing red and yellow along the wall. I was thrown into the crushing river of bodies, all headed in the same direction, the direction of the smoke. My vision blurred with tears and forced the breath out of my chest. One glance over my shoulder was enough to see some of the older kids, both boys and girls, dragging out the blue cabinets from their room and knocking them over in front of the silver double doors at the other end of the hallway. We weren't evacuating at all. We were escaping. My vision was swimming in black by the time we were pushed through the other set of doors and into the cramped stairway. The smoke was thickest there, rising not from shimmering flames, but 2 small black canisters, the kind PSFs kept hooked on their belts, waiting to be thrown into the crowd of unruly kids. So the PSFs set them off. No, that wasn't possible. It was much more likely a few kids had nabbed them to get the alarms going and the doors open. That was probably the extent of their emergency protocol. We were trapped in that stairwell, our bodies pressed against everyone else's in one shivering mass of nerves and exhilaration. I tried to keep my eyes forward and feel for the steps under my feet, but it was hard not to see what the darkness and flashing lights were doing to the other kids. Some were crying hysterically. Some looked on the verge of passing out, but some were laughing like it was all a game. I don't know how I spotted the other small Asian girl
Under the tide of hands and heads, she was wedged in the bottom left corner of the stairwell, standing on her toes, her green uniform barely visible. Her hair was gleaming black under the emergency lights, and her arm was above her head, outstretched toward me. The minute I made eye contact with her, her face lit up recognition. I saw her mouth form Zoo's name. I tried to reach out to grab her hand, but the swarm of people around me pushed me down, jostling forward. By the time I turned around, she had disappeared too. I didn't see one PSF or camp controller, not until we were at the base of the stairwell, stepping over, but mostly on, the 3 prone black figures on the ground. Their faces were swollen into bruised masks. Blood collected on the ground under them. Someone, probably a blue, had ripped the doors from their hinges and sent them flying outside into what looked like a wasteland of white snow. The ground was unnaturally bright under the moonless sky, partly from the dream, partly from the searchlights that switched on as the pitch of the alarm changed from a trill to a warning siren. Once we were out those final doors, we were running. The snow was knee-deep, and most of the kids weren't wearing anything beyond their paper-thin uniforms. Most of them hadn't even remembered to put on their shoes. Tiny flakes floated into the deep intersecting lines of footprints, and for a moment I felt myself slow, watching the way the snow was neither flying nor falling, just hovering there, like a held breath, lighting up like 1,000 fireflies under the camp searchlights. And then the spell was broken, shattered with the first gunshot, and then it was bullets flying over us, not snow. The screams ripped, jagged, and piercing from the throats of hundreds, 5, 10, 15. It was impossible to count the kids that suddenly pitched forward, falling face first into the snow, screaming and howling in pain. A nightmarish red began to creep through the snow, like spilled ink spreading, expanding, devouring. I reached up to my cheek, to the wetness there, and when I pulled my hand away, my brain finally connected that I had run straight through a spray of blood. I was covered in it. Someone else's blood was dripping down my cheeks and off my chin. We ran harder, faster, toward the back right corner of the chain link fence surrounding the old school. I threw a look back over my shoulder to the brick school building, to the dozens of black figures on top of its gray slate roof, to the dozens more pouring out from the first-story windows and doors. When I turned back, the field in front of me was covered in heaps of every color, yellow, blue, green, and red. So much red. They formed lines, unwilling barriers that others had to jump over to keep going. I fell toward, barely catching I fell forward, barely catching myself on the snow. Someone had caught my ankle. A green girl, on her stomach, crawling toward me. Her eyes open, her mouth gulping at the air. "Help me!" She was sobbing, blood bubbling up over her lips. "Help me!" But I got back up and ran. There was a gate at this edge of the camp. I could see it now, that I was within a few 100 feet of it. What I couldn't see was what was causing the backup of kids. Why we weren't dashing through the gate to get to freedom. With a jolt, I realized there were almost 3 times as many kids down in the snow behind me than there were in front of me. The cluster of kids surged forward with a unified wail, hundreds of hands straining forward. My size made it easy for me to slip through legs and fight my way up to the front, where 3 older boys in blue uniforms were struggling to keep the crowd of kids back from both the gate itself and the one-man watch booth beside it, which was currently playing host to 3 people, an unconscious PSF, Liam and Chubbs. I was so shocked at the sight of them, I nearly missed the blur of green that was a little kid rushing for the fence. He darted around the teenagers in his path and threw himself against the bright yellow bars, holding the gate firmly in place. He had only just touched it when all of the hair on his head seemed to stand on end, and a burst of light flashed under his fingers. Instead of releasing it, his hand only seemed to clamp down harder, frozen in place as thousands of volts of electricity sent his body into a frenzied fit of shuddering. Oh my God. The gate was still on. Liam and Chubbs were trying to turn it off. I felt my own scream bubble up in my throat when he collapsed to the ground, finally still. Liam yelled something from the booth that I couldn't hear. Not above the screams from the kids around me. The sight of that boy burst the temporary bubble of calm in a heartbeat. The PSFs were closer now. They had to be, because when they started firing again, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. Each layer of kids fell down and away, peeling back to reveal a new, fresh layer for the kill. I couldn't see the snow beneath them anymore. Kids turned and bolted in every direction, some heading back toward the school, and others following the edges of the electrified fence, looking for another way out. I heard dogs barking and the growling of engines. Combined, the noise sounded like a monster straight out of hell. I turned to look at the trail. The animals and snowmobiles were blazing toward us when something hard slammed into me from behind, throwing me into the thick snow. I'm shot, I thought, half in shock. No, that wasn't right. The blow had come from an elbow to the back of my head. The blue girl hadn't even seen me as she turned and ran back toward the camp. I rolled over just in time to see her with their hands in the air, a clear surrender, and still they shot her. She shrieked in pain and crumbled to the ground. It wasn't just the girl who hadn't spotted me in the snow. No one did. I felt my arms stinging with the cold strand as I tried to push myself up and out of its freezing touch. But every time I made progress, another foot came slamming down across my shoulders and back. I had enough time to cover my head, but that was it. There was no getting air to my chest. I was screaming, and no one could hear. Rage and despair ripped through me. The crush of stampeding kids pushed me deeper and deeper into the snow. I kept thinking, can you drown like this? Can you suffocate in the freezing dark? Would it be better to die this way? Hands reached around my waist. Freezing air flooded my lungs in a single painful gasp as I was lifted up and out of the snow. The gate was open now, and the kids, who had been steady and calm enough to remain, who had been lucky enough not to be hit, poured through, running for the dense cluster of trees ahead. There couldn't have been more than 20 of the hundreds of kids who had flooded through the halls of the old school. 20. I felt warm, impossibly warm. The arms holding me tightened. When I looked up, it was into Liam's bright eyes. Hang on tight, okay? Zoo woke up with a gasp, coming up from her nightmare for a long drag of air. I was thrown out of the dream, sent hurtling back into the freezing hotel room, through the topsy-turvy vertical that slammed into me. I turned towards Zoo, my eyes adjusting just enough to make out her silhouette. When I reached for her, I found someone else's hands already there. Liam shook his head, trying to snap himself out of sleep's lingering grasp. Zoo? He whispered. Hey, Zoo. I stayed perfectly still. Hey, Liam said gently. You're okay. It was just a bad dream. My gut twisted when I realized she was crying. I heard a scraping sound, wood against wood, like he had taken something out of the nightstand. Write it down, Liam said. Don't force yourself. It must have been the hotel stationery. I shut my eyes, waiting for him to switch on the cheap nightstand lamp, but he kept to his rule. No lights outside the bathroom. What are you sorry for? He whispered. The only one that needs beauty sleep is Chubbs. She let out a shaky laugh, but her body was still tense next to mine. Was it the same as before? The bed dipped as Liam sat down. A little different, he repeated after a moment. Yeah? The silence stretched a little longer this time. I wasn't sure she was still scribbling in the darkness until Liam cleared his throat and said in a rough voice, I could never forget that. I was really worried.
you had tried to touch the gate before Chubbs figured out how to switch it off. And then, so soft that I might have imagined it, he said, "I'm so sorry." The guilt and misery that coated the words were like a kick to the chest. I felt myself shift forward on the bed, drawn to the pain there, desperate to reassure him that what had happened there in the snowy field hadn't been his fault. It scared me knowing how well I understood him in that moment. But I couldn't. This was a private conversation, just like her memory had been private. Why was I always trespassing into places I didn't belong? Chubbs isn't the only one that thinks it's too dangerous, but I think Ruby's tough enough to make it without us if she wants to. Why? More scribbling. The only thing Chubbs wants is for us to be safe, he said, still whispering. Sometimes that gets in the way of him doing what's good for others. Seeing the big picture, you know? It's only been 2 weeks since we got out. We gotta give him more time. He sounded so confident. Then, that I felt a small part of me give. I believed him. Oh man. I could practically see him running a hand through his hair. Never be ashamed of what you can do. You hear me? If you hadn't been there, we wouldn't be here. The room settled back into a peaceful quiet, save for Chubb's wheezing snores. You feeling better? He asked. Need anything from Betty? She must have shaken her head, because I felt the bed shift again as Liam stood. I'll be right here. Just wake me up if you change your mind, okay? I didn't hear him say goodnight, but instead of laying down, I saw him sit back flush against the bed, watching the door and anything that might come through it. A few hours later, with the moon still visible in the gray-blue morning sky, I gently untangled Zeus' fingers from the front of my dress and slipped out of the bed. The red glow of the alarm clock on the nightstand burned the time into my mind. 5:03 p.m. Leaving time. None of us had really unpacked our things on Liam's insistence, but I had to collect my toothbrush and toothpaste from where I had left them next to Chubb's in the bathroom. There was one set of Hojo toiletries left out by the sink next to the world's ugliest coffee maker. I stuffed them into my bag, along with one of the smaller hand towels. Outside, it was only a few degrees warmer than it had been in the room. Typical bipolar Virginia spring weather. It must have rained the night before, too. A feathery white fog threaded through the cars and nearby trees. The minivan, which last night had been parked on the far end of the lot, was now stationed directly in front of the hotel room. If I hadn't walked
right by Black Betty, running my hand against her bruised side, I don't think I would have seen Liam at all. He was kneeling beside the sliding door, slowly scraping off the last of the Betty Jean cleaning sign with his car keys. At his feet was the Ohio plate that had at one point been screwed into place. My feet drifted to a stop a few feet short of him. There were dark circles under his eyes. His face was drawn in thought, his mouth set to a grim line that didn't suit him at all. With his damp hair combed back and his face clean shaven, he could have looked a good 2 or 3 years younger than he had the day before. But his eyes told a different story. My shoes scuffed the loose asphalt, catching Liam's attention. He started to rise. "What's wrong?" "Huh? You're up early," he explained. "I usually have to drag Chubbs into the shower and blast him with cold water to get him going." I shrugged. "Still on Thurman's schedule, I guess." He rose to his feet slowly, wiping his hands on the front of his jeans. The way his eyes flicked toward me made me think he wanted to say something, but instead he only gave me a small smile. The Ohio license plate was tossed into the back seat, and in its place was a West Virginia plate. I didn't have a chance to ask where it had come from. I dropped my backpack at my feet and leaned against the minivan's door. Liam disappeared around the back of the car, reappearing a few minutes later with a red gas can and a chewed up black hose in hand. With my eyes closed and ear pressed against the cool glass, I soaked up the honeyed sing-song radio commercial for a local grocery store. When the broadcaster came back on, it was with a grim forecast of whatever was left of Wall Street. The woman read the stock report like a eulogy. I forced my eyes open, letting them fall where Liam had been standing only a second before. "Liam?" I called before I could stop myself. "Over here," came the immediate reply. With a quick glance to the row of aquamarine motel doors, I shuffled around the back of the van until I was a few feet behind him. I stood on my toes, leaning to the right to get a better look at what he was doing to the silver SUV parked next to the van. Liam worked silently, his eyes focused on the task at hand. One end of the hose was shoved deep into the belly of the SUV's tank. He looped the excess length of the unruly hose around his shoulder and let the other end fall in the red can. "What are you doing?" I didn't bother to hide my shock. His free hand hovered over the length of the hose, gliding it back in our direction. It was almost like he was tugging in a line, or at least motioning someone forward. A few drops of pungent liquid began to drip from the free end of the hose. Siphoning gas, I realized. I'd heard about people doing this during the last gas shortage, but I'd never actually seen it done before. The liquid began to fill the can in a smooth pour, filling the space between us with a sharp odor. Gas crisis, he said with an unapologetic shrug. Times are a little desperate, and we were running on fumes for a while yesterday. You're blue, right? I said, nodding toward the hand guiding the gas into our red can. Could you just move Betty along without it? Yeah, but not for long. Liam sounded shy. When he pressed his lips together, they turned an unnatural shade of white and highlighted a small scar at the right corner. When I realized I was staring, I squatted down beside him, more to hide my embarrassment than actually help. Stealing gas was surprisingly not all that complicated. I guess I'm just impressed you can use your abilities at all. A part of me wondered then, if I hadn't had it backward this entire time, the way things were at Thurman, the camp controllers were so vigilant about making sure that we were terrified of getting caught using our abilities, and we were made to understand from the beginning that what we were and what we could do was dangerous and unnatural. Mistakes and accidents were not excuses, and punishment was not avoidable. There was to be no curious testing, no stabbing at the limits to see if there was a way to push through them. If Liam was so accomplished with his abilities, it probably meant he had taken years to practice. Most of those spent outside of camp walls. It never occurred to me to think that other kids safe at home, hiding out, that the others who had never seen the inside of a cabin experienced the grave and still nothing that was life at camp, might have managed to teach themselves amazing things. They weren't afraid of themselves. They weren't crippled by the weight of what they didn't know. I had the strangest feeling, like I had lost something without ever really having it in the first place. That I wasn't what I once was, and wasn't at all what I was meant to be. The sensation made me feel hollow, down to my bones. The whole thing's pretty straightforward for us blues, Liam explained. You look at something, concentrate hard enough to imagine that object moving from point A to point B, and it just does, he said. I bet a lot of the blues at Thurman figured out how to use their abilities. They just chose not to. Maybe something to do with that noise. You're probably right. I hadn't had enough interaction with the blue kids to know. Liam jerked the hose back and forth. As the stream of gas slowed to a measly drip, I glanced up, searching the parking lot, and motel doors for signs of life, and didn't settle back down until I was sure we were alone. Did you teach yourself? I asked, testing my theory. He glanced my way. Yeah, I went into camp pretty late and had plenty of time alone, bored out of my mind, to figure things out. Naturally, the next question was, were you in hiding? But I wouldn't be able to ask that without him asking about my history and how I was caught. This had to stop. My hands were shaking, like he had just told me he was about to strangle the life out of me. Nothing he had done up until now had proven him to be anything other than nice. Hadn't he shown me time and time again that he was willing to be my friend if I was willing to let him? It hadn't been so long since I'd even wanted a friend that I wasn't sure I even remembered how to go about making one. In the first grade, it had been stupidly simple. Our teacher had told us to write down our favorite animal on a sheet of paper, and then we had to go around the room until we found someone with a matching animal, because making friends was supposed to be that easy. Apparently, finding someone else who liked elephants. I like this song, I blurted out. Jim Morrison's voice was soft and barely reached us from where it was filtering through Betty's speakers. Yeah, the Doors. Liam's face lit up. Come on, baby, light my fire, he crooned in a low voice, trying to match Morrison's. Try to set the night on fire. I laughed. I like it when he sings it. Liam clutched his chest like I had wounded him, but his recovery was quick. The radio DJ announced the next song. It was like Liam had won the lottery. Now this is what I'm talking about. The Allman Brothers? My eyebrows were inching up my face. Funny, I pegged him for a Zeppelin fan. This is the music of my soul, he said, nodding his head in time with the music. Have you ever actually listened to the lyrics? I asked, feeling the anxiety lift off my shoulders. My voice was growing steadier with each word. Was your father a gambler down in Georgia that wound up on the wrong end of the gun? Were you born in the back seat of a Greyhound bus? Hey now, he said, reaching over to flick my hair. I said it was the music of my soul, not my life. For your information, my stepdad is a mechanic down in North Carolina, and as far as I know, still alive and well. But I was born in the back seat of a bus. You're joking. I honestly couldn't tell. I am not. It made the newspaper and everything. I was the miracle bus boy for the first 3 years of my life, and now I'm trying to make a living and doing the best I can, I finished. He laughed, the tips of his ears tinged with a faint pink. The song went on, filling the air between us with its rapid pulse and relentless guitars. Every piece fit together effortlessly. Not quite country and not quite rock and roll, just warm, fast southern. I liked it even better when Liam started singing along. When the flow of gas had stopped, he carefully pulled the hose free and replaced the gas cap. Before he stood, Liam knocked his shoulder into mine. Where in the world did you get that dress? I snorted, picking at the skirt. Present from Zoo. You look like you want to throw it into a fire. I can't promise there won't be an unfortunate accident later on, I said very seriously when he laughed again. It felt like a small victory. Well, Green, it was nice of you to put it on, Liam said. Though be careful. Zoo's so starved for girl time that she might turn you into her own personal dress-up doll. Kids these days, I said, think the whole world belongs to them. He grinned. Kids these days. We moved from car to car, working our way down the parking lot. He didn't ask for my help, and I didn't ask him any more questions. We could have stayed together in the comfortable silence for hours, and it still wouldn't have been enough for me. And that, my dear friends, is the end of chapter 12. Please tune in next time for chapter 13. And another thing I'd like to say is I am going to be doing another few stories for the Book of the Bazaar, Freaky Facts and Strange Stories. So tune in for that. And as always, have a wonderful morning, noon, or night, wherever you are. Ruby, out.